30. I would say that these announcements are a repeat of yesterday, but they're really targeted at all the people who are still in bed because they were at the social last night, clearly. So I hope you all enjoyed the social. So just a few quick announcements. First of all, I thank you once again to our host and sponsors, particularly ICANN for hosting the meeting, VeriSign as our patron for both our workshops in 2019, APHIC is a sponsor, associate sponsor for this workshop, Diamond Key Security is a contributor sponsor, and thnic.ri as our in-kind local sponsor. Okay, and we're having clicker problems again. No, we're having Keith brain problems. Okay, so this is the Wi-Fi details again. If you didn't get a chance to check out the demos that Jerry is doing by the registration desk of our various software tools, he will be there today for that as well. Breaks are in the foyer. The lunch is in the restaurant back towards the lobby. The toilet is on the way to that. Again, if you have any dietary restrictions, please speak to Dinesh. He'll be happy to advise on the food. Fire exit is either out that side or out the hotel lobby, but basically in the event of a fire alarm, follow the instructions from the hotel staff. Matt will be doing the PGP signing session during the last half hour of lunch. There's still time to participate in that, but please get your keys. No, there isn't. Okay. So if you didn't send your keys in, it's tough. But Matt will be in here at 1:30 to do that. We've only got 2 lightning talk submissions so far, so there's still room for lightning talks. We'll be doing these the final program session today, so please email them to submissions by the start of the coffee break at 10:30 today so that the program committee has time to review them and accept them. Okay, well, we had the social event. And don't forget that we're webcasting, so please line up at the microphone and identify yourself and your affiliation if you have questions to ask. And thank you, everybody, for really active engagement and participation with the questions yesterday. I hope we can keep that going. We've got all the speaker slides, so thank you all for that. And also, speakers, don't forget that the timekeeper is counting down not to the end of your speaking slot, but to the end of you speaking, and there is still time after the countdown to 0 for questions and answers within the allocated slot. Yeah, thank you everybody for adhering to the conduct policy so far. If you need help, board, PC, and crew have red lanyards. And again, if you weren't here yesterday and you're a first timer, welcome. I'm sure all the old hands will help you out. Okay, I will now hand you over to Program Committee Member Anand Budev, who's the session chair for this morning, he'll be introducing the various speakers.
Good morning. I'm Anand Budev, and I'm a member of the DNS-OARC Program Committee. I'll be chairing the session this morning. Just a reminder that if you come up to the microphone, please state your name and affiliation before asking your question or making a comment. Our first speaker for this morning is Willem Toorop of NLNet Labs, and he is here to present OpenINTEL.
Thank you. Yes, so OpenINTEL is a project, a collaboration of University of Twente, SurfNet, SCDN Labs, and NLNet Labs. NLNet Labs joined basically last November when Roland van Rijswijk also joined NLNet Labs. So he sort of brought that project to our foundation. So OpenINTEL started almost 5 years ago in late 2014. the idea was to set up measurements to look into mitigation against denial of service attacks. And it started with setting up measurement infrastructure and accumulating a collection of zone files. And with the goal of measuring large parts of the global DNS on a daily basis. But then the OpenINTEL, we realized many applications on the internet have some form of presence in the DNS, and it's actually interesting to have this collection of data also to look into other services. And in this talk, we will discuss why we wanted to do this, how we do it, and then give a few examples of what we have learned so far. So, yeah, like I said, the original goal was to track the use of distributed denial of service protection services, but soon it was realized that every network service relies on the DNS in some way, and consequently the DNS, or the history of how DNS data evolves, tells a story about the evolution of the internet and its protocol. So some of you might be familiar with passive DNS. It's also keeping a history of DNS data, but it does it differently in the sense that it does it passively. So it doesn't provide the regular time series that we would like. We would like to have a data point for every delegation, second level delegation, and a day. So this cannot be done with passive DNS because you see only what people are actually asking for. So you don't see what's already in the zone, but only what's been asked for. And also you have no control over when those requests are done. So the OpenINTEL performs active measurements instead. It sends a set of queries to all covered domains once every 24 hours. So we send queries for the SOA record, NS set, both at the, well, we of course know the NS set at the delegation point because of the zone files. For the MX records, also the IP addresses of the names they point to, and also TLSA records, for example. Other typical queries are for DNS keys and CDS and CDNS resource records. And we do this at scale. With those GTLDs, .com, .net, .org, info, mobile, and all the new GTLDs that we can get our hands on, together with the CCTLDs that allowed us to use their zone files to do these kind of measurements. We're covering over 260 million domains per day. And okay, so the next slide is going to be about big data. Big data? Yes, because the amount of data is in the same order of magnitude that we collect each day as the amount of base pairs in a human genome. And so this has been ongoing since February 2015, and so 3.1 trillion names or resource record sets have been collected since then, so that's more than 1,000 human genomes already. We try to do it responsibly. So we have clearly marked the address space for which we do the measurements, and also reversed DNS is set up. We're scanning from or doing the queries for all those delegation points with IP addresses from that block. And also we contacted large operators like .com or the larger hoster providers that they might see a lot of queries coming from our vantage points. Also, we spread out all the queries over the day. It's one data point per day for each delegation, and those are spread in the lower right corner. You see the graph of how all the queries are spread out over the day. So, what can you do with all this historic data about all those domains over this long area? Well, we will illustrate the use of OpenINTEL with 3 examples. First, we will have a look at DNSSEC operational practices. Then we have a look in how OpenINTEL can help in improving DNS resilience. And the last example is a funny example, like what we are also doing queries for all the delegation points for the TXT record, and people put all sorts of funny things in that resource record, which is kind of fun to look at. Yeah, so this is to consider the impact of DNSSEC deployment incentives. You might know that .nl and .se, they have a rather high DNSSEC deployment due to financial incentives. If you register a domain name with .nl or .se and you sign your zone with DNSSEC, then you get that domain for less money, cheaper. So our reasoning was that that's nice, but it's only a small benefit, so that would probably only be of benefit to really large operators and not to the smaller ones. And also, the incentive is just for deploying DNSSEC, and it has not a requirement on security best practices. So we predicted that the way DNSSEC was deployed was perhaps not the best way one can do that. So this is historic data out of OpenINTEL at a certain point, which is now. And these 2 graphs represent the operators that have DNSSEC signed data. And you can clearly see that on the left, so the red areas are 80% of the operators. So in .nl, the 80% of operators are covered by of domain names, sorry. The graphs represent the 80% of DNSSEC signed domain names, the red parts in that graph. And in .nl, that red area is covered with just 14 operators. And in .se, it's even a little bit worse. 80% of all signed domains are covered by just 3 operators. Now, the table below shows you how many zones those operators have. So those 14 operators covering 80% of all signed zones have 4.5 million zones in .nl, and they almost 3 million of them are signed. And which is similar with .se, 1 million or the large operators have 1 million of the zones and 700,000 sites. In both cases, is almost 63% of all signed zones, versus around 1% with the .com, .net, and .org. And the small operators for .nl and .se, you still see the DNSSEC incentive in action there. The percentage of signed zones is larger than in ComNet and .org, but much smaller than what the larger operators do. So it's easy to check, or it's possible to check with OpenINTEL the historic data, and we noticed that those operators, those large operators, actually never, or almost never, roll their zone signing key. And also, they are not compliant to DNSSEC operational best practices. Their zone signing key is too small. They don't roll that often, and well, at least that's what we see for the larger operators in .se and .nl. So this work was presented at the Internet Days of the IIS, the .se operator, and last November last year. And at the same time, the .se IIS increased their requirements for the DNSSEC incentive, that people that wanted to have this financial benefit had to do some explicit security requirements. And this was in November, and we can already see that this has already impacted how DNSSEC is deployed in .se. For example, on the left, one of the optional requirements that operators could do was to introduce TLSA records. And on the left, you see the uptake of the TLSA records for mail domains within several domains. It's the operator here that introduces all those TLSA records is one.com. And I think it's also interesting to see that this security improvement also spills over to other domains. So one.com does it because it can get the domains in .se cheaper that way, but also other top-level domains like .nl and .com benefit from this, because that same operator also has domains in those other top-level domains. On the right, you see a operator, and let me check which operator this was. Yes, Binero. So they decided to roll to a better algorithm. So the announcement was made in November. In December, they all removed their DS record. All their zones went insecure and came back in January with a better algorithm, you know, the elliptic curve. So that's what's there on the right bottom. So OpenINTEL can also, we can also look into historic data surrounding attacks. So this is the aftermath after the attack on Dyn in 2016. The graph that is shown is the number of NS records which are exclusive with Dyn, or if the NS set also includes NS resource records that are not Dyn. So it's only a small percentage, perhaps only 2% of the Dyn customers, though those were all the big internet brands that suffered from that attack. So we can see that the attack had this effect on the topology of the internet. OpenINTEL is now also collaborating with Qaeda and the University of California, San Diego on the MedViper project. We're looking into internet topology and configuration, like parent-child delegation mismatches, TTL mismatches, how much shared infrastructure there is, and how many topological bottlenecks. So, for example, this is the TTLs on the NS sets, which are used by delegations of names in .com. So you can see that 90% of the TTL, so the TTL in .com is set to 2 days, but already 90% of the delegations prefers their NS set to be 1 day, and almost 65% prefers their TTL of their NS set to be less than 6 hours, actually. So and they want that because then they can switch over to different operators more quickly, and also respond to DNS hijacks more quickly. Topological diversity is important by looking at the NS sets. We see that in .com, 3/4 of all delegations are within the same AS. In .nl, this is almost half. We also look into IPv4 prefixes. So in .com, more than half of all the name servers in an NS set is within the same announced IPv4 prefix. So the assumption then, or we suspect that those name servers, at least more than or 2 name servers, could be in the same data rack, in the same data center. And we now starting a student project with Ripe Atlas to see, with triangular measurements, to see if that's indeed the case. So example 3, what people put in text records. Well, we see all sorts of interesting HTML snippets, JavaScript, Windows, PowerShell code, and other scripting languages, which appear to be part of operations which might not be, have the best intent for the internet at heart. Some malicious scripts appearing there, which are interesting to study. We also see X509 certificates and quite funny pieces of DNS zone files in text records. But the most interesting thing we found, and let me say this well-known maxim, never attribute malice that which can adequately be explained by stupidity. Or say private key. There are quite a few of these, and this one was particularly interesting because we also found the matching DKIM record, including the public key of that RSA key, right? So, future of the project. We are talking with the Dutch Science Council to establish that we can do this or collect these data for the upcoming years, so that we in 25 can still do long-term reflections on how things changed on the internet, looking at DNS zone data at a secondary level. And have a real-world impact by doing research based on this data, looking into resilience and security of the DNS. So, questions?
Alex Mayhofer from Nick.at. I can only say thank you to you guys for doing that. We are one of those who appreciate getting daily fresh data about essentially the whole DNS of our zone, and we use it for quite a couple of interesting insights and also operational findings. So it's really an amazing data set. So my only question is that going to be something that you guys are going to provide for the next foreseeable future, and it's funded, or?
Yes, yes. So
because it's quite big infrastructure.
Yeah, indeed. Also, maybe I have to tell. Yeah, so yes, indeed, we're getting sponsorship to make sure that this data will remain and that we can keep collecting incremental amounts of data and put it in our Hadoop cluster, etc. And but also I want to. You are a good example because you are one of the top-level domains which is. Measured with OpenINTEL, and so it's of benefit to you, you say. So if there are any other top-level domains here in the room, and they want to benefit from this data as well, then you can contact me, and we can set up some agreement that for us to use your zone files to get additional data for the OpenINTEL project.
Yeah, maybe one use case that I share, we do actually crawl the starting page of each of every .at domain that seems to have an A and quad A or a .dub record. And so what we use OpenINTEL for is when we see that the A record for a page, for a website has changed, then we schedule a recrawl for the next day. So that's really useful. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. Okay. Yeah, I guess that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Willem. That was a very interesting presentation. Next up, we have Ray Bellis and Ólafur Guðmundsson presenting about what DNSKEY floods tell us about resolvers.
I figure out which glasses I need to wear. Right. Sorry, excuse me 1 second. There we go. Perils of growing old. Right. It's working. So I'm Ray Bellis from ISC. To my right, I'm sure you all know Ólafur Guðmundsson from Cloudflare. So we're going to be talking about this odd thing that happened last year. Apparently there was a key rolled in the DNS or something like that. As many of you know, there were some concerns about what was going to happen. Would the internet actually cope with the key rolling? Would the internet break? Would people fail to get answers because the packet size was going to be increasing? From the binding side of things, we had some concerns, of course. Would our 5011 implementation work correctly? Thanks very much to the ICANN folks for their testbed, which we did make use of. That worked very well. Excuse me. We also had concerns at ISC about whether other people's versions of bind might work correctly or not. And we're looking at, excuse me, there's the lack of sleep getting to me. And, looking at the trust anchor signaling, we also had concerns about how accurate that would actually turn out to be. Our own data analytics platform at ISC is not that great, and with Cloudflare running some F-root nodes on our behalf, we also asked them to look at the data for us. So the data source to be looked at, aggregate data with NASA's permission, because Cloudflare also serve e-root sites, so there's going to be some data here from NASA as well. There's the RSAC 002 data that most of the RSOs produce that shows the total traffic across the internet, or sorry, the total DNS traffic to the root system, which interestingly, if you look at this graph, has grown substantially over the last 18 months or so. We're seeing something in the order of 1 million queries per second across the entire root system, So yeah, 50% growth since January last year to April this year. And we've also looked at the data that ICANN produced from the Octo team on the data they received, the summary data from the RFC 8145 signaling data. So yeah, that ICANN data, it was a daily summary report. There were two different formats of this data produced over time. So the first one included quite a lot of information, including basically all key IDs, individual IP addresses, the counts of the number of times each IP address was seen. They later reduced that to only include the ASN and the IP address, and essentially only one record per day per IP address. It didn't include the counts of how many those IP addresses, the counts of how many times each IP address had been seen within each day. And I'll pass over now to Ólafur to talk more about that.
Yeah, so this is an example of the first format. I pulled out one semi-random address. Exact address is not important, but through the basically first 3 weeks of June last year, it kept flipping between true and false as it is reporting the new one or not. And, but it is showing up solidly, basically showing up every day. The TA report that ICANN got was not comprehensive. They did not get all of the instances of all root servers reporting it, so maybe queries went somewhere else. So why is it going up and down, true and false? Well, let's look at this guy a little bit more in detail. It's a typical resolver for a broadband provider. Okay? The best explanation I have for this going up and down is it is actually receiving TA from somebody behind it. So it is acting like a forwarder. Okay, so the signal that is being seen has lots of noise in it in this regard. So it's hard to draw a conclusion what machine is actually originating signal of being bad. This is exactly what ICANN discovered when they tried to action this data. With the phase 2 data, the thing that is interesting in that one is to look at the number of addresses that are reporting the old. Okay? And fortunately, we see that it is going down, with one exception. More about that later. So we can summarize the signal is not actionable on day-to-day basis. It is possibly actionable when we see shifts in it, as we're going to see a little bit later. There is also a bias in this. Anybody who is running a local route in accordance with RFC 7706 is not showing up in there. I checked a few network AS numbers that are where I know people are doing that, and none of them showed up, not even a single time, in the data sets that we looked at. And also, there is not every root server in there instance. There is also lots of IPv6 addresses in there. We know that lots of DNS query engines, they talk both v4 and v6. There is no way to correlate between the two. So somebody may showing up not too often, but that's because half the time it's showing up as a v4 and sometimes it's showing up as a v6. A very interesting thing was when I started counting how many different unique addresses came out of different ASs. And if you look at those ASs that had the largest number of reported addresses, basically they can be classified into, well, broadband networks as we expected, i.e. possibly people running or validating resolver on a machine at home or something like that. Cellular network was a little bit of a surprise, but then you look at that little bit more detail, and third or non-Europe, non-US cellular providers were much more representative in there. That means either they have both landline and cellular, or cellular is the only way to get internet access. So, and there is also obviously lots of carrier-grade NAT going on in there. So addresses are changing all the time. It's not uncommon to see an address basically seeing 4 or 5 addresses a day from a carrier, and then they're always different. So they are being translated. And the other thing was big cloud compute providers like DigitalOcean and others, they have a large number of these, and they also do not have address stability. The addresses change over time. That means that some of the assumptions we have made about resolvers in the past is that they have always had the same addresses. No, addresses on many of these devices change over time, and either because they move or because they are being spun up, spun down, they move from here to there, whatever reason. So resolvers that are being seen are not necessarily coming from fixed addresses. Okay.
Right, so looking at the actual traffic that we saw, hopefully it's not too much surprise to many of the people here that DNSKEY traffic had some interesting artifacts, but we'll go into more detail of that later. So this graph shows the change in the DNSKEY traffic at the point at which KSK 2017 was added in July of 2017, and effectively there was no change. System kept on running as usual. Don't know too much about the line at the bottom. Sorry, the line at the bottom is E-route, the top line is F-route, and the change there is not because the key been added, it was just an internal change within Cloudflare's network. So then, when eventually the key did roll in October last year, there was a slightly surprising increase in the DNSKEY traffic, the order of 4 or 5 times increase. The actual volumes are fairly negligible still, to be honest. I mean, it's, I'll read that here, sort of 500 or 600 queries per second across the whole of the ENF systems between them. Unexpected, but actually not concerning operationally in any way. The TA signal, I think I was, sorry, I've got to carry that on. Yeah, that did change a little bit. There was actually a spike in the number of systems that only reported the 2010 key, which our analysis would suggest that some resolvers did not like that key role and were essentially trying to keep on fetching the keys when they shouldn't have been doing. So yeah, that medium impact, well, we've said on this slide a 3 times increase. And it stayed quite steady for quite some time after that key roll. So yeah, there was a rise over a period of 2 or 3 days. So it wasn't an immediate jump. It did take a little time to come through. And having jumped, it pretty much stayed there. Again, the spike on that graph on the right is just a measuring artifact, so that's not real. But then the real fun started when the key was revoked in January. And suddenly it went up another further 5 times. Again, this took a little while, it took a day or so, but yeah, it was odd. Nobody was expecting this at all. There's no real explanation for it. A number of people, research groups and other RSOs did look at this, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that later. Fortunately, I mean, the volumes of packets concerned are still not in any way operationally concerning. I mean, 4,000 queries per second over across the whole of the ENF route was not a problem. Sorry, hand back to Ólafur for this bit.
Yeah, so we were looking at this graph that are showing us what is the change in the TA signal when this happens. We see that suddenly the ones that are advertising that they trust only the new key because the old key was revoked, that happened. But this is happening way faster than we expected. We expected like when we switch keys, then we saw the new key go up slowly. This one is basically down, almost instantaneous. Why? Well, it turns out that not everybody who sends a TA signal is equal. This is the biggest reporters in 1 hour at some point in time. Somebody is sending basically 2 a second. Others are sending of the order of 1 or less. So the signal that was in the prior graph is biased by the ones that send a lot. And the ones that are having either problem or were very good are sending it. The reason why they send this TA signal is not clear. We know that one implementation sends it periodically. Another one says they do it whenever they see a DNS key query. And there is one that looks like it sends it on every query and may be amplified for every query when it is having problems. So yes, but then let's look at what was the change over a few days. So the day before, these are 2 1-hour windows, few days apart, before the revocation and after the revocation. The blue arrows show the good movements, i.e. the one that understood both or accepted both, they went down. The one, why there was somebody who only trusted the new key before, I don't know, but it goes up. The ones that only trust the old one, they went down. I guess that should be a good one too. There are some really strange TA strings that also show up in the sample, and we have no explanation of it. I did not go down all the list, but there was somebody who kept sending religiously that they trusted DLV.isc. And yeah, so basically lots of resolvers or validators picked up the new signal, removed the old key as expected, relatively fast. So this basically means resolvers that are configured to follow 5011 are doing the right thing. 5011 is not the only way to configure validators with trust anchors. Some operators prefer to do that via configuration files, and that is probably what is explaining why the ones that are on line 2 in the second graph we are still seeing 4,000 some with the old, with both keys. I would expect over time that that will be updated manually or via the system, and that count is going to go down.
Thanks, Olaf. So, following that initial sort of 5-fold increase, things then started to get very, very strange. The previous graph really only showed that first quarter of this graph here. So we had an initial 3-fold increase. And then there was a slow but quite steady increase, trying to read the dates there, through early February. Mid-February, if you look at this, about 14th, 15th. And then you'll see there's a somewhat steep rise in the gradient until just before the start of March. And then suddenly all hell breaks loose. And it goes way, way up. Fortunately, this is still way, way below our capacity, so that, again, it's not operationally concerning. But this was something of a mystery. I mean, why should some 6 weeks after the roll, we're still well outside the 5011 hold down timer for the revocation of the key? Why would things suddenly jump up like this? I'm afraid, to a certain extent, this is still a little bit of a mystery, although we do have some ideas. And again, I'm sure there'll be more about this later during today's talks. And this graph here actually shows the entire, I think, sort of 9-month window, roughly, of the entire key roll cycle. So the very small uptick, about a quarter of the way through, is when the key was first rolled. There's a fairly steady level. I mean, there's a discernible increase in the DNS key traffic, but it's flat. And then you can see these sort of 4 separate phases. And then you see at the end, when the key was finally removed, a very sharp drop in the DNS key traffic. So suddenly, for some reason, systems that were entirely unhappy with the key being revoked just fixed themselves when the key was actually finally removed from the zone. Skip that one. We'll include this one in the deck just so people can refer to it if they want to. There's just a bit more detail on these phases. But that drop I mentioned when the key was removed was incredibly sharp. It actually took less than 2 seconds between when the key was removed from the zone and the vast majority of that new DNS key traffic coming in. the systems that were effectively responsible for that traffic noticed that removal essentially instantaneously. The resulting levels are now back to where we were immediately post-roll, so they're still a little bit higher than they were before the key was rolled at all, but yeah, it's now 100 or so queries per second. So there are clearly some systems that are still not entirely happy. The key has been rolled, but it's essentially business as usual. There's a little bit more detail on that drop. Again, this is that graph on the left is only about a 20-second window. And so that traffic drop, hopefully you can see the titles on the graphs. The left one is the DNS key traffic. The right-hand graph is the number of unique sources of the DNS key traffic that were being seen. The yellow and green being NASA and ISC, ENF routes respectively, and the blue being the total. So there were in fact distinct populations there. It is not the exact same set of sources sending the traffic, but the overall levels were consistent between the two before and after the removal. So the current state of things, the traffic is as it was immediately post-roll. A collection of the TA signaling is still happening. As Olafur said earlier, the actual counts are not especially relevant, we think, but what's most interesting is the way the counts change over time. There are still, unfortunately, 100 source IP addresses telling us that they still only know about KSK 2010. But the only reading we can make of that is that they're presumably not validating, because otherwise they would have fixed them by now. The vast majority of systems, the 75%, are now only reporting the new key. There is still a substantial number of machines that still reporting both keys, but at the very least they're not getting validation failures because they do now have the new key. Again, these are systems that are probably not validating, but they have at least managed to roll the key, so if they are validating, it will be working. Okay, so any questions, please? Thank you. Thank you.
So Warren Kamari, Google. Partly a question and I guess also partly just a statement. Can you go back to the summary of TA stuff? It was a fair bit further back.
That one?
No, further back. One more. Actually, you know what? I can just start talking. So something that I'm slightly annoyed about is for both of these, Wes Hardeker had provided a bunch of research, and one of the big signals for the 8145 stuff was a VPN app on a bunch of cell phones. And that was a huge contributor to the data, and looks as though that might still be the hasn't been updated yet app, which is providing some of the signal of, looks like I'm validating, but not really. Mm-hmm. And then the other one, for the DNS key thing, on the KSK Futures mailing list, Wes had sent out a bunch of detail about configurations in bind, where a single query causes 6 or 7 outgoing queries.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And the sort of tone of the response to that was largely, that's an old bug, it doesn't really exist anymore, that's not it. There was some follow-up saying, but look, it still happens, and then it all sort of went radio silent. So I'm slightly miffed at the not mentioning a bunch of research which had shown some of this sort of no credit being given, and then also the, hey, look, I think we found it, and no real follow-up from that.
Our focus was just looking at traffic. We are not trying to do any attributions of what this was. So yes, there is other work, and there's a talk after this one that may be going into that detail. Yes, Wes.
Hi, Dwayne Wessels from VeriSign. A couple of comments, I guess. I think the slide that that Warren was trying to get you to, you had a summary slide that said
This one?
Yeah. So your first bullet point here says that the TA signal is mostly noise. I think you've done a pretty bad job of showing that it's mostly noise. You showed one example of a mixed signal, but that doesn't mean that it's mostly noise. In fact, a lot of the signals are pretty clear that it's not mixed, right? They're consistent. The ones that are mixed are in the very small % of sources that are that are noisy. I think it's far from mostly noisy.
I guess I phrased this really badly. What I meant is you cannot look at one day's data and draw conclusions from it. You can only see the changes in the pattern.
And I'll be the first to admit that this protocol has issues. I mean,
Yes.
it is difficult to interpret in some cases, but there's also cases where it's pretty clear to interpret what's going on, and I'll talk about that more. You had a slide later that talked about how some sources were sort of pounding you with trust anchor signals, and I agree that does happen. I think in this case, it's not important to count the number of signal queries that you get. It's important to count the number of sources, the number of IP addresses sending you these type of signals. So this is unfortunately what's happening, but we have to deal with it, right?
But it explains why I had this happen in this graph that is counting.
Yeah, right. But it's better, in a graph like this, it's better to count sources, not queries.
Yes.
And last point is, at the end, I think, Ray, you said something about there may be sources that have the old key, but they're not validating. Right, and in fact, there was a bug in a version of Bind, I think, where it was reporting the trust anchor signal, even though it was not configured for validation. So it was unbound? Oh, I thought it was Bind. Anyway, so yeah, that did happen. Unfortunately, that's an implementation mistake in the 8145 protocol.
I need to refer that one back to Andre, but I have a recollection that there may have been a version of Bind for a while.
I know it was fixed, but it did get out there, and it's in the wild, right?
So I think if you go 2 slides further, then I have a question. Further. This one, yeah. Any idea why some of the sources are still querying and why some are not? I mean, there's all, in addition to the traffic, there seems to be a huge reduction in actually source IP addresses that are querying.
Don't want to speak too much on this one because I'm aware that there's some stuff that's going to be following, but there's clearly a software issue. Yes, some of it is going to be attributable to Bind. We do think it's probably related to misconfigurations predominantly, where, for example, the systems can't write to their managed keys directory. So even though they may have seen the new key, they can't actually write that state out to the system.
Once it's gone, they don't try anymore.
Yeah, it basically seems that way. Just to answer Warren's point about old software, I mean, we have attempted to replicate the issue, had some success, and we also know that it's not possible to replicate it deterministically. Wes's reports did mention being able to replicate something with 9.11, but we've been unable to produce that. We did reproduce some stuff with 9.10. But in any eventuality, it did only appear to be on generally older versions and only in the cases where there was some configuration issue preventing the key from running correctly. So we haven't yet been able to identify any specific bug. I mean, admittedly, sending a lot more queries than we should do is not a good thing. In fact, although we didn't report it on these slides, the top IP address sending the DNSKEY queries was actually responsible for 10% of the entire volume. It was 100 million queries a day we were seeing from that one IP address, which is crazy. But we can't pin down exactly why it did it because we haven't found anything to fix. And to some extent, it may have even been a previous edge case version of rollover and die.
Thanks.
When I saw that one machine that was sending that enormous amount of, my first thought was, oh, it is some custom code by somebody that does not know about the revoke bit and it decides this is bad data, so let me get it again. Went through every version of Bind, couldn't find that. Looked through every version of Unbound, didn't find it there. So, I don't know.
First, I was wondering if you could find the slide that has all the arrows going different directions.
Question?
Yeah.
Please identify yourself.
Sorry, Brian Dixon, GoDaddy.
Yes.
I think in some of those cases, what you have as a single arrow is really 2 different things going in 2 different directions. So the top left, the 28690, I think it's actually bifurcating to two different destinations where one of them is the top one and the other one is the second one, i.e. it's indicating that there's a bunch of systems that have switched, but the quantities have not changed. And similarly, I think there's one or two other places where it's one arrow, but there might actually be some convergence and divergence. Anyway, we can follow up on that. The other thing I'm wondering about is when the TA stuff was originally being designed or discussed, I think there's some signal that could be extracted or added by adding a prefix to, or not a prefix, but a child record that's, for instance, like the hash of the IP address that would allow you to distinguish sources that have the IP address that you're seeing being the thing that's actually generating the TA versus forwarding. And the other thing that might be interesting to also consider putting as a child underneath the underscore TA of whatever value is some ID about what software it's running. That's just suggestions, but I think that would allow you to get signal, and systems that don't upgrade, you'd be able to derive that from the fact that they don't do the new thing.
Joe Abley, PIR. Some time ago, before I was at PIR, ICANN actually paid me to call people and ask why they were sending these queries. And it turns out you actually can't pay people enough to do that because it's a horrible job and don't ever do it. And it's also incredibly difficult to track down people these days. It was easier in the 80s. And, but one of the things that did stand out is that there were a large number of big sources of 8145 traffic that were non-validating resolvers at big carriers that didn't support 8145 in any way. And they were just forwarding queries from downstream. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a couple of graphs here where you talk about number of sources, but you're not really talking about numbers of sources of the queries, really. You're talking about number of senders of queries as seen by ENF. Yeah. You're not talking about the ultimate sources of them. So I think sometimes you have to be a little careful.
This is actually from the ICANN report.
Okay, sometimes you have to be a little careful to attribute behavior to an address when it might be sitting in front of 100,000 devices all doing different things.
Exactly. Yeah, I was really surprised, for example, when I saw a lot of Comcast addresses in there. And basically, some customers sending it to theirs, yeah.
So I think one takeaway that I talked about this at some ICANN meeting, but I can't remember when, but is if anybody ever decides to write another protocol specification like this, they have to remember that in those cases, those big resolver clusters have no ability whatsoever to look back in time and say, why did that query come through and where did it come from? There is no such data for them to do that. So it's not a good mechanism when you're trying to identify behavior of end sources that are multiple hops behind.
Agree 100%. And the other question should be asked is there should we have the signal in the first place? But that's
not tall enough. So Warren Kamari, just quickly following up from your comment on not being able to recreate it. I believe that West still has his test infrastructure set up, and it was something like bind 911.5 something from Fedora. If you reach out to him, I'm sure he'll be happy to give you configs and let you test it some more.
Yeah, no, Evan Hunt has been working with Wes to try to do so. But again, it's not deterministic. It doesn't always, you cannot reliably recreate the conditions. Thank you. All right, thank you all.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Ólafur, for this very interesting presentation. Our next presenter is Dwayne Vessels from VeriSign. At the speaker's request, this session is not going to be live streamed. So immediately after this, the live stream is going to be paused. This session is going to be recorded and will be made available later.
Exciting.